Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing study of the year 1968. In the previous lecture, we talked about the presidency of Lyndon Johnson and the years of the mid-1960s. And as we inch our way closer to the start of 1968, and we're almost there, we need to spend a little bit more time talking about the popular culture of the mid-1960s, which sets the stage for the epic year of 1968 itself. In a previous lecture, I mentioned some of the 1950s television shows that were popular, and in general, I described them as white, polite, and satisfied. A show like I Love Lucy pushed the edges somewhat in the 1950s. By the 1960s, a number of cutting-edge shows challenged many of the conventions that were popular on television up to that point. And two of the most popular shows on television in 1968 itself were the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour and Laugh-In. The Smothers Brothers starred the two brothers, Tom and Dick Smothers. They were clean-cut. They started out as folk singers in San Francisco and had made television appearances before. In 1967, they were picked up by CBS and given their own show. Their show included many barbed sketches against the Vietnam War, big business, religion, the president, and so on. Their guests included Joan Baez and Pete Seeger, protest singers of the age. Over time, their show became even more controversial, and by 1968, it was ranked 18th overall in the ratings, and one of the top in the 16 to 24-year-old demographic. But by 1969, the controversy was too intense, and CBS pulled it in favor of the country comedy show Hee Haw. A similar, yet even more successful show was NBC's Laugh-In, which began in 1968. It was loaded with topical content, quick cuts, and one-liners. An ensemble cast of comedians, including some greats like Goldie Hawn and Lily Tomlin, attacked the Vietnam War, conformity, the church, and many other issues. The comedians at Laugh-In constantly battled network censors. Still, for 2 of its 5 years on television, Laugh-In was the #1 rated show. By the mid-1960s, rock and roll music was becoming an even more influential cultural phenomenon, and we'll talk much more about it in the year 1968 itself. Leading up to that year, performers like Peter, Paul and Mary, Joan Baez, Phil Ochs, and Bob Dylan injected political content into folk music. Dylan became one of the most innovative forces in music throughout the decade. A college dropout, he became known in New York City for his acoustic performances and lyrics. He addressed issues of racial injustice, the generational divide, and authority and peace. He took his guitar to the battlefronts in America, not worried about record sales. He performed at the 1963 March on Washington, performing only a pawn in the game about the slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers. On the 25th of July, 1965, Bob Dylan plugged in his guitar at the Newport Folk Festival and went electric. A symbolic moment in rock and roll history, ranked as one of the most important in the history of music, as Bob Dylan steered other artists in the direction of the electric guitar and rock and roll. Dylan was very influential with the most important band of that era, and maybe the most important band of all time, the Beatles. Raised in working-class Liverpool, England, during the recovery from World War II, the Beatles in their early lives were surrounded by misery and poverty. They felt the snubs of the upper classes and developed a rebellious edge. Their early career in the shabby clubs of Liverpool and Hamburg, they appeared wearing leather jackets and t-shirts, contrary to the clean-cut image they presented in the United States years later. Already a popular group in England, In 1964, they hit the United States. In January of '64, I Want to Hold Your Hand hit number one on the pop charts and sold at a rate of 10,000 copies per hour in New York City alone. The next month, they made their epic debut on The Ed Sullivan Show, drawing a record audience of 73 million viewers, widely considered the most important moment in rock and roll history. By April, they had all 5 of the top 5 places on the Billboard chart. The Beatles had a profound cultural impact, and their timing was perfect. By the mid-1960s, the baby boom generation was looking for something fresh. The assassination of John F. Kennedy late in 1963 left many disillusioned by the buttoned-down consensus culture advocated by their parents. As one fan declared, "My mother hates them, my father hates them, my teacher hates them. Can you think of 3 better reasons why I love them?" The Beatles also offered a fresh-faced enthusiasm and joy in an increasingly dark time after the assassination of Kennedy. They also represented a new style. They had changed their dress to clean-cut coat and ties, and they brought a festive spirit. While not gyrating in the Elvis style, they jiggled, moved, smiled, and laughed on stage, encouraging the audience to enjoy themselves. They arrived in the United States to Beatlemania, hordes of crazed young girls lusting after them and chasing them everywhere. This accompanied the increasing sexual revolution, and similar to Elvis, represented a liberation of pent-up feelings in many young girls. The Beatles also revolutionized the recording industry. They were among a handful of artists who insisted on writing and performing their own music, after a few successful covers early in their careers. They also insisted on having some control over the engineering of their albums. As they said, "We gradually became the workmen who took over the factory." They also tried to resist the constraints of show business, paving their own path. They didn't want to become a package sold to the public in a particular way. After a few early performances, they established a policy of no official functions, ever. Despite their insistence on artistic and personal freedom, they still began to feel as if they were living in a fishbowl. Few performers have endured such public adoration and obsession. They were constantly approached by fans, many asking for simple requests like a touch, a kiss, a photo, a lock of hair. These endless requests became tedious. The Beatles began making movies, such as A Hard Day's Night in 1964 and Help in 1965, that reflected this theme of demanding fans. And we'll talk about another of their movies, Yellow Submarine, that came out in 1968. Talk about that later in the course. The movies were both comedic and dark, and showed an unsettling relationship between the band and their fans. In these films, they are constantly on the run from hordes of fans, accompanied by sometimes wild songs and laughter. Exhausted after a U.S. tour in 1965, they returned to England to rejuvenate themselves and find more artistic inspiration. Their new music reflected the influence of Bob Dylan, whom they met in 1964. He introduced them, incidentally, to marijuana. Their new music became more introspective and reflected the influence of mind-altering drugs. Dylan also offered them a role model of an independent artist who managed to rise above the throngs of adoring fans and still forge a lifestyle of his own making. In turn, the Beatles influenced Dylan, who in this period began to move away from purely acoustic music. As I mentioned, on July 25, 1965, he appeared at the Newport, Rhode Island Folk Festival in a colored shirt and played electric versions of Like a Rolling Stone and other songs. It was his first significant performance without acoustic guitar and was transformative for rock and roll. While many of the folk singers despised this new Dylan, many other performers took it as license to move in new directions. And the Beatles, too, were ready to move in new directions. Music was entering one of its most glorious periods. Dylan had gone electric and was inspiring other musicians. In Detroit, the Motown recording studio was churning out some of the greatest songs ever recorded by a host of talented black artists like Smokey Robinson, the Supremes, and Marvin Gaye. And we'll talk a lot more about Motown in our study of 1968. In that spirit, the Beatles recorded the album later described by Rolling Stone magazine as the most important rock and roll album ever made, an unsurpassed adventure in concept, sound, songwriting, cover art, and studio technology, rock's greatest declaration of change. Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The album took some 700 hours to make, from late 1966 to April 1967. It was a concept album, the songs revolving around a unified story and theme. They used multi-tracking to have songs sound as if hundreds of instruments and voices were performing simultaneously. The songs were also full of drug references. McCartney later explained the inspiration for the album. In a word, drugs. Pot. Meantime, another British band was having a significant impact on the American rock scene. The Rolling Stones, formed in mid-1963, drew heavily from the American blues. They attempted to present an image in stark contrast to the clean-cut Beatles. They seemed threatening, uncouth, even animalistic at times. As one writer remarked, "The Beatles may want to hold your hand. The Stones want to burn your town." Their U.S. tour in the fall of 1964 was a smash hit. And by the late 1960s, their songs took on a political edge and more suggestive themes, such as sympathy for the devil, which the band allowed people to interpret as they wished. And we'll talk a lot more about the Rolling Stones in 1968 as well. By the later 1960s, a new wave of rock performers was raising cultural and political consciousness. The Beatles themselves now wore long hair, mustaches, and love beads. Another British group, The Who, presented an even more threatening hard rock image and sound. Other artists such as Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison and the Doors, the Grateful Dead, and Jefferson Airplane embraced the counterculture, which we'll talk much more about later. The new rock and roll music found a new home on FM radio. While developed in the 1930s, FM didn't become really popular until the 1960s, when crowded AM radio bands encouraged newer stations to seek out new frequencies. By 1967, rock and roll stations with adventurous disc jockeys were common on the FM dial. FM disc jockeys played longer tracks, like the 6-minute Hey Jude, and sometimes whole album sides. They often played several commercials in a row and then played uninterrupted music for a half hour or more. Finally, popular culture also reflected the sexual revolution of the 60s. In 1959, the Barbie doll made her debut. Barbie revolutionized the doll industry, as she represented a full-grown woman as opposed to a baby. While some questioned her exaggerated proportions and obvious consumerism, the pressure of girls to buy the dolls was overwhelming, and Barbie became a fixture in popular culture in the 60s. In 1960, the sexual revolution entered a new phase with the introduction of the pill. In 1962, Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl became a smash bestseller. While she largely reinforced traditional gender roles, she did encourage women to enjoy their single lives, to postpone marriage and enjoy sex. This was a radical position, encouraging single women to have sex before marriage. Also, movies of the late 1950s and early 60s more frequently depicted sexual situations. The old guard of movie makers was retiring or dying off, and a new breed with more innovative thinking was on the rise. Also, in 1954, a man named Jeffrey Sherlock became the director of the Hollywood Production Code. Sherlock had greater appreciation of adult content than his predecessor, and thus allowed greater depiction of sexual situations on screen. By the late 1950s, virtually anything short of, quote, nudity, sexual perversion, and venereal disease could be shown on film. By the 1960s, even those restrictions were being pushed. One ploy was to produce films based on best-selling novels that broached sexual topics. One example was the film Peyton Place, made in 1956. Based on Grace Metalius' sensational novel, the novel contained just a few racy scenes, but it addressed the fact that women in a small New England town had sexual needs and desires, and the town became a place full of dark secrets, teen abortion, abuse, and hot gossip. The movie version accentuated every suggestive scene and contained much more sexual content than the book. This formula was played out successfully several more times in the 1960s. A similar theme is evident in the James Bond series, based on the novels by Ian Fleming. Between 1962 and 1971, 6 of his spy novels were brought to the big screen, and again, any opportunity to introduce sex was taken advantage of. Still, the women in the films were strong, athletic, independent, free, and sexual. While remaining within the production code restrictions and keeping the women in lingerie, the Bond films still pushed the limits of what could be shown on screen. We'll talk about all of these themes and more when we talk about popular culture in our year 1968. In our final preliminary lectures, we'll talk about the background for another enormously popular feature, an important feature of life in 1968, the Civil Rights Movement.